The morning of her wedding dawned grey and cold, as if the very heavens mourned the sacrifice of Miss Evangeline Hartwell's freedom upon the altar of family debt and social obligation. At 19, she stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom for what would be the last time, a reflection showing a young woman whose beauty was overshadowed by the terror that had haunted her eyes for the past 3 months, ever since her father had announced her betrothal to the most feared man in all of England. His Grace the Duke of Ravenshollow, Adrian Blackwood, was a man whose very name could silence a ballroom and whose reputation for cold cruelty had made him the subject of whispered warnings among the ladies of the ton. At 35, he had buried 2 wives under circumstances that polite society chose not to examine too closely, and his dark countenance and forbidding manner had earned him the sobriquet, the Devil Duke, among those brave enough to speak of him at all. Evangeline had never spoken to him, had barely glimpsed him across crowded ballrooms where he stood like a spectre at the edge of festivities, his presence casting a shadow over even the most joyous occasions. What she knew of him came from whispered gossip and her own observations of how others reacted to his proximity, the way conversations died when he approached, the way even the boldest debutantes found urgent business elsewhere when he entered a room. Now she was to become his third Duchess, bound to a man who inspired fear rather than love, whose previous wives had died young and whose household was said to be run with the iron discipline of a military garrison. Her father's gambling debts had made her a commodity to be traded, and the Duke's need for an heir had made her the perfect solution to both their problems. What Evangeline could not know, as she prepared for what she believed would be her doom, was that the man she feared above all others had spent the past 3 months planning a wedding gift that would not only shock London society, but reveal truths about his character that would transform her understanding of everything she thought she knew about love, marriage, and the man who was about to become. Dear husband, stay with me until fear transforms into wonder, and a wedding gift reveals the true heart of a man the world had misjudged. The ceremony took place in the ancient chapel of Ravenshollow Castle, a Gothic edifice that seemed to embody all of Evangeline's fears about her future. The stone walls, blackened by centuries of candle smoke, rose toward vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadows, while narrow windows filtered what little daylight penetrated the Yorkshire gloom into pale, ghostly beams that did nothing to warm the oppressive atmosphere. Evangeline walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her steps echoing in the vast space like a funeral march. The assembled guests, a mixture of her family's modest connections and the Duke's more illustrious acquaintances, watched in silence that felt more appropriate to a wake than a wedding. Even her own relatives seemed subdued, as if they understood that they were witnessing not a celebration but a sacrifice. At the altar stood Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow. In all his forbidding magnificence, he was taller than she remembered, his broad shoulders filling his perfectly tailored black coat with an authority that seemed to command the very air around him. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and classical features that would have been beautiful if not for the cold remoteness of his expression. When their eyes met, Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's ancient stones. His gaze was the color of winter storms, grey and impenetrable, revealing nothing of his thoughts or feelings about the woman who was about to become his wife. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, to see some hint of kindness, some suggestion that her fears were unfounded. Instead, she saw only the controlled indifference of a man conducting a business transaction. "Dearly beloved," intoned the Archbishop of York, his voice echoing off the stone walls with sepulchral gravity, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words that followed passed in a blur of terror and resignation. Evangeline spoke her vows in a voice barely above a whisper, her hands trembling as Adrian placed the heavy gold band upon her finger with movements that were precise and impersonal. When the moment came for him to kiss his bride, his lips barely brushed hers, a cold, formal acknowledgement of their new status that held no warmth or promise of affection. "I present to you," the Archbishop announced with what seemed like forced cheer, "His Grace the Duke of Ravenshollow and Her Grace the Duchess." The applause that followed was polite, but restrained, as if the guests were uncertain whether congratulations or condolences were more appropriate. Evangeline felt the weight of her new title settling around her like chains, binding her to a life she had never wanted, with a man she had every reason to fear. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the castle's great hall, a cavernous space dominated by portraits of previous dukes, whose stern faces seemed to watch the proceedings with disapproval. Long tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes that few seemed inclined to enjoy, while conversations proceeded in hushed tones that spoke more of funeral propriety than wedding celebration. Evangeline sat at the high table beside her new husband, acutely aware of his imposing presence and the way other guests seemed to avoid looking directly at him. He spoke little, responding to congratulations with curt nods and brief acknowledgements that did nothing to encourage further conversation. When he did address her, it was with the same cold courtesy he showed to everyone else, polite, proper, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Your Grace," said Lord Pemberton, one of the few guests brave enough to approach the high table directly, "may I offer my congratulations on your marriage? The Duchess is a most lovely bride." "Indeed," Adrian replied, with the kind of neutral politeness that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Lord Pemberton, I trust you are enjoying the festivities." It was not a conversation so much as an exchange of formalities, and Lord Pemberton retreated as quickly as courtesy allowed, leaving Evangeline to wonder if all her interactions with her husband would be conducted with such chilling reserve. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself studying Adrian's profile when she thought he wasn't looking, searching for some clue to the man beneath the forbidding exterior. His features were undeniably handsome. The strong jaw, the aristocratic nose, the well-shaped mouth that might have been sensual if it ever relaxed from its current stern line. But there was something in his bearing, some quality of controlled tension, that suggested depths she could not fathom. It was during the presentation of wedding gifts that the first hint of something unexpected emerged. The usual array of silver, jewelry, and ornamental objects was displayed with appropriate ceremony, each gift announced by the major domo with the kind of pompous formality that such occasions demanded. Evangeline accepted the congratulations of the gift-givers with gracious smiles that felt increasingly forced as the afternoon progressed. "And now," the major domo announced with obvious anticipation, "His Grace the Duke of Ravenshollow wishes to present his wedding gift to Her Grace the Duchess." A murmur of interest rippled through the assembled guests as Adrian rose from his chair with fluid grace. Wedding gifts from groom to bride were traditional, but given the Duke's reputation for austere practicality, expectations were modest, perhaps a piece of family jewelry or a set of books appropriate to a duchess's education. What happened next would be talked about in London drawing rooms for months to come. Adrian moved to a side table where a leather portfolio lay waiting, its simple appearance giving no hint of the extraordinary contents within. As he opened it and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents, the murmur of conversation in the hall gradually died away, replaced by an expectant silence that seemed to press against the ancient walls. "Evangeline," Adrian said, using her given name for the first time since their wedding vows, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, "I hope you will find this gift acceptable." He handed her the documents with a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial, and Evangeline accepted them with hands that trembled slightly as she began to read. At first, the legal language was difficult to parse, but as the meaning became clear, her eyes widened with shock and disbelief. The documents were deeds, property deeds, transferring ownership of 3 substantial estates to her name alone. But these were not just any properties. They were the very estates that her father had lost to gambling debts, the ancestral lands that had been in the Hartwell family for generations before her father's weakness had forced their sale. I don't understand," Evangeline whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent hall. These were my family's lands." "They are your lands now," Adrian said quietly, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Evangeline, I have purchased them from their current owners and transferred them to your sole ownership. They are yours to do with as you see fit, to keep, to sell, to give away. The choice is entirely your own." The implications of his words sent a shockwave through the assembled guests. A husband giving his wife independent property ownership was unprecedented in their social circle, where married women's assets traditionally became their husband's property upon marriage. But more than that, the Duke had somehow discovered which properties held sentimental value for his bride and had taken steps to restore them to her family. "But how did you—" Evangeline began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had done. "I made inquiries," Adrian said simply, though the effort and expense such inquiries must have required was staggering. "I thought you might wish to have them back." The understatement was so profound that several guests actually gasped. The properties in question were worth a fortune, and the Duke had not only purchased them, but had given them away as a wedding gift, asking nothing in return. "Your Grace," said Lady Pemberton, her voice tight with shock. "Surely such a generous gift comes with certain expectations." "The only expectation," Adrian replied with a coolness that somehow managed to be both polite and cutting, "is that my wife will know that she enters this marriage not as a supplicant or a debtor, but as a partner whose happiness and security are of paramount importance to me." The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and speculation that would spread far beyond the castle walls. The Devil Duke, the man feared throughout London society for his cold cruelty, had just publicly declared his wife's happiness to be his primary concern, and had backed that declaration with a gesture of unprecedented generosity. Evangeline stared at the documents in her hands, then at the man who had given them to her, struggling to reconcile this act of extraordinary kindness with everything she had been told about her husband's character. The estates represented not just financial security, but the restoration of her family's honor, the return of lands that held generations of memories and meaning. I cannot accept this," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your Grace, the expense, the generosity, it is too much." "It is exactly enough," Adrian replied firmly. "Evangeline, you came to this marriage with nothing, because circumstances beyond your control stripped away what should have been yours by right. I am simply restoring what was taken." "But why?" The question escaped her before she could stop it, raw with confusion and desperate hope. "Your Grace, why would you do such a thing for someone you barely know?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an expression she could not read. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful, but there was something beneath the surface that made her heart race. "Because, Evangeline, I believe that a marriage built on fear and desperation cannot produce the happiness that both parties deserve. I hope that by removing the circumstances that made this union necessary, we might discover whether something better is possible between us." The admission sent another wave of shock through the assembled guests. The Duke of Ravenshollow had just publicly acknowledged that their marriage was one of convenience, while simultaneously expressing hope that it might become something more. It was a level of honesty and vulnerability that no one had expected from the man they knew only through his fearsome reputation. "Your Grace," Evangeline said softly, tears gathering in her eyes as the full impact of his gift began to sink in, I don't know what to say." "Say that you will give us both the chance to discover what we might become together," Adrian replied, his voice so quiet that only she could hear it. "Evangeline, say that you will not let fear of what others believe about me prevent you from forming your own judgment." Before she could respond, the moment was interrupted by the majordomo's announcement that it was time for the traditional toasts. But as the guests raised their glasses and offered their congratulations, Evangeline found herself looking at her husband with new eyes, seeing not the monster of reputation, but a man who had just demonstrated a capacity for thoughtfulness and generosity that challenged everything she thought she knew about him. The wedding gift had indeed shocked the entire ton, but its greatest impact was on the bride herself, who was beginning to wonder if the man she had married might be very different from the man she had feared. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to take their leave, Evangeline clutched the property deeds to her chest like a talisman, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just occurred. The Duke had not just given her land, he had given her independence, security, and the freedom to choose her own path. More than that, he had shown her that he was capable of understanding what would matter most to her, and acting on that understanding with breathtaking generosity. For the first time since learning of her betrothal, Evangeline allowed herself to hope that her marriage might be something other than the prison she had feared. The man who had just become her husband remained largely a mystery, but his wedding gift had revealed depths of character that gave her reason to believe that their future together might hold possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The Devil Duke, it seemed, might be capable of kindness after all. And if that were true, then perhaps everything else she had been told about him might be equally false. As evening approached and the last of the wedding guests departed, Evangeline found herself alone with her husband in the great hall of Ravenshollow Castle, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions and newfound uncertainty. The property deeds lay on the table before her, like evidence of a miracle she still struggled to believe, while Adrian stood by the massive fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. "Your Grace," Evangeline said finally, her voice echoing in the vast space, "I must ask, how did you know? About the estates, I mean. How did you know which properties would mean the most to me?" Adrian turned from the fire, his grey eyes reflecting the flickering light as he studied her face. "I made it my business to learn about you, Evangeline, about your family, your history, the circumstances that led to our marriage. You investigated me?" The thought should have been alarming, but instead Evangeline found herself curious about what he might have discovered. "I sought to understand the woman I was to marry," Adrian corrected gently. "I learned that you had been raised on those estates, that your childhood was spent in their gardens and halls, that they represented not just financial security, but emotional connection to your family's legacy, and you thought to restore them to me." It was not a question but a statement of wonder. "I thought to give you back what should never have been taken from you," Adrian said simply. "Evangeline, your father's debts were not your responsibility, yet you have paid the price for them. It seemed unjust." The word hung between them, revealing more about Adrian's character than hours of conversation might have done. Here was a man who thought in terms of justice and fairness, who had seen an injustice and had taken steps to correct it. "Oh, Your Grace, the expense must have been enormous. Why would you spend such a fortune on someone you had never even spoken to?" Adrian moved closer, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor until he stood just a few feet away from her. This close, Evangeline could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his mouth softened slightly when he was not maintaining his public mask. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "because I understand what it means to lose something precious through no fault of your own." The admission was so unexpected, so personal, that Evangeline felt her breath catch. "Your Grace? My first wife, Catherine, died in childbirth along with our son. My second wife, Margaret, died of consumption after 2 years of marriage. Both deaths were unexpected, and both left me with the understanding that life can take away what we value most without warning or reason." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable, and Evangeline felt her heart clench with sympathy for this man who had endured such losses. "I am so sorry, Your Grace. I had heard, that is, I knew you had been married before, but I did not know the circumstances. The circumstances were tragic, but not mysterious despite what society chooses to whisper," Adrian said with a bitterness that suggested he was well aware of the rumors that surrounded his previous marriages. "I did not murder my wives, Evangeline. I simply had the misfortune to lose them to the same forces that take many young women, childbirth and disease." "I never believed such rumors," Evangeline said quickly, though she realized as she spoke that this was not entirely true. She had been frightened by the whispers, had allowed them to color her perception of the man she was to marry. "Did you not?" Adrian asked with a sad smile that suggested he knew better. "Evangeline, I have seen the fear in your eyes since the moment we met. I know what society says about me, and I know that you have heard those whispers." I was afraid," Evangeline admitted, her cheeks burning with shame. "Your Grace, I had never met you, and the stories were designed to explain why a duke would remain unmarried for 5 years after his second wife's death," Adrian said, with understanding rather than anger. "Society cannot comprehend that a man might choose solitude over the risk of further loss, so they invent darker explanations. Is that why you remained unmarried? Fear of loss?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire as he considered her question. "Partly, but also because I could not bear the thought of entering another marriage of convenience, another arrangement based on duty rather than affection. I had hoped," he paused, then continued with obvious difficulty, "I had hoped that if I ever married again, it would be for better reasons." "And yet you married me," Evangeline said softly. "A woman you had never spoken to, in an arrangement based entirely on convenience. I married you because I needed an heir, and you needed security," Adrian said with painful honesty. "But Evangeline, I gave you those estates because I hoped that by removing the desperation from our situation, we might discover whether something genuine could grow between us." The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility and uncertainty. Evangeline stared at this man who had just revealed depths of character that challenged everything she had believed about him, who had shown her kindness when she had expected cruelty, generosity when she had feared exploitation. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion, I would like very much to discover what might be possible between us, but I must confess that I know nothing about you beyond the rumors, and I fear that you know far more about me than I do about you." "Then perhaps we should remedy that imbalance," Adrian said with the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Evangeline, what would you like to know?" The question was so simple, yet it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. He was offering to share himself with her, to move beyond the formal politeness that had characterized their interactions thus far. "Everything," Evangeline said without hesitation. "Your Grace, I would like to know who you are when you are not being the Duke of Ravenshollow. I would like to know what makes you happy, what you fear, what you hope for." "That is a considerable request," Adrian said with amusement. "Perhaps we should begin with something simpler. What would you like to know first?" Evangeline considered the question, then asked the one thing that had puzzled her most about the day's events. "Why did you choose to give me the estates publicly? You could have told me privately, could have made the gift without the entire ton witnessing it." Adrian's expression grew serious as he considered her question. "Because, Evangeline, I wanted there to be no question about your status in this marriage. I wanted everyone present to understand that you are not a victim or a charity case, but my wife and my partner, deserving of respect and consideration. You were protecting my reputation. I was establishing it," Adrian corrected. "Evangeline, society will judge our marriage based on how I treat you. If I treat you as an equal, they will respect you as such. If I treat you as a possession, they will see you as one." The thoughtfulness behind his actions left Evangeline speechless. Not only had he given her an extraordinary gift, but he had done so in a way that elevated her status and commanded respect from their peers. "Your Grace, I have misjudged you terribly," she said with obvious remorse. "I allowed fear and gossip to color my perception of your character, and I am ashamed of my prejudice." "You had no reason to think otherwise," Adrian said gently. "Evangeline, I have cultivated a reputation for coldness and distance because it serves my purposes. People fear what they do not understand, and fear can be useful in business and politics. But it must be lonely," Evangeline said with sudden insight, "to be feared rather than known, to have people avoid your company rather than seek it." Adrian's expression flickered with surprise at her perceptiveness. "It has been isolating," he admitted, "but loneliness seemed preferable to the alternative." "What alternative?" "Vulnerability," Adrian said simply. "The risk of caring for someone and losing them again." Evangeline felt her heart ache for this man who had protected himself from further loss by building walls that had kept out not just pain, but also joy. "Your Grace, may I ask you something that might seem impertinent?" "You may ask me anything. Do you regret marrying me? Now that you have met me, do you wish you had chosen differently?" Adrian stared at her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. "Evangeline, I regret the circumstances that made our marriage necessary. I regret that you were forced into this union against your will, but I do not regret marrying you." "Why not?" "Because in the few hours since we exchanged vows, you have shown me more genuine curiosity and compassion than I have experienced in years," Adrian said with quiet intensity. "Because you looked past the rumors and the fear to ask about the man beneath them. Because you have given me hope that perhaps I was wrong to believe that caring for someone always ends in loss." The admission was so honest, so vulnerable, that Evangeline felt tears gathering in her eyes. This was not the cold, cruel man she had feared, but someone who had been wounded by life and had learned to protect himself through distance and reputation. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I cannot promise that caring for me will not bring you pain, but I can promise that I will never deliberately hurt you, and that I will do everything in my power to prove worthy of the kindness you have shown me today." "You have already proven yourself worthy," Adrian said, moving closer until he stood just an arm's length away. "Evangeline, you could have accepted my gift with simple gratitude and asked no questions about my motivations. Instead, you sought to understand, to see beyond the gesture to the man who made it. That kind of perception, that willingness to look deeper, it is exactly what I had hoped to find in a wife." "And what else had you hoped to find?" Evangeline asked, her heart racing at his proximity and the warmth she could see growing in his eyes. "Partnership," Adrian said without hesitation. "Companionship. Someone who could share not just my name and my home, but my thoughts and my dreams and my hopes for the future." "And do you think, that is, do you believe such a partnership might be possible between us?" "I believe," Adrian said, reaching out to gently touch her hand, "that it has already begun." The touch was gentle, tentative, nothing like the cold formality of their wedding ceremony. Evangeline felt warmth spread from the point of contact, a tingling awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing attraction she was beginning to feel for this complex, thoughtful man. "Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I would very much like to learn more about the man I have married. Not the Duke of Ravenshollow, but Adrian." Would you tell me about yourself? About your hopes and dreams and the things that matter to you? Adrian's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, transforming his entire face and revealing the warmth that had been hidden beneath his controlled exterior. Evangeline, I would be honored to share such things with you, but perhaps we should begin with something simpler, dinner and conversation, and the chance to discover whether we might enjoy each other's company. I should like that very much, Evangeline said, her own smile reflecting his warmth. Your Grace. Adrian, thank you. For the estates, for your honesty, for giving me hope that our marriage might be something beautiful rather than something to be endured. Thank you, Adrian replied, for being willing to look past the rumors to see the man beneath them. Evangeline, you have given me something I thought I had lost forever, the possibility of happiness. As they made their way to the dining room together, Evangeline marveled at the transformation that had occurred in the space of a few hours. She had entered the day as a terrified bride, convinced that she was marrying a monster. She was ending it as a woman who had discovered that her husband was not only kind and generous, but capable of the kind of thoughtfulness and vulnerability that made true partnership possible. The wedding gift had indeed shocked the ton, but its greatest impact had been on the bride herself, who was beginning to understand that the man she had feared might actually be the answer to dreams she had never dared to voice. The Devil Duke, it seemed, was nothing more than a lonely man who had learned to protect his heart behind a facade of coldness. And if Evangeline had anything to say about it, those days of loneliness were about to come to an end. The weeks that followed their wedding brought a series of revelations that continued to transform Evangeline's understanding of the man she had married. Far from the cold, forbidding master she had expected, Adrian proved to be a thoughtful companion who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her opinions, and her comfort. Their days settled into a routine that was both surprising and delightful. Each morning, Adrian would join her for breakfast in the morning room, where they would discuss their plans for the day and share observations about everything from the weather to the books they were reading. These conversations revealed a man of considerable intelligence and unexpected humor, whose dry wit and thoughtful insights made even mundane topics engaging. Evangeline, Adrian said one morning as they sat overlooking the castle's gardens, I have been thinking about the estate you inherited in Derbyshire. The steward's reports suggest that the tenant farmers there have been struggling with poor harvests. Yes, I noticed that in the documents you provided, Evangeline replied, touched by his attention to her affairs. I have been wondering what might be done to help them. There are new agricultural techniques that might improve their yields, Adrian said thoughtfully. If you are interested, I could arrange for an expert to visit the estate and provide guidance. The expense would be minimal compared to the potential benefits. You would do that? Help me manage my properties. Evangeline, your success reflects well on both of us, Adrian said with obvious sincerity. More than that, I want you to feel confident in your ability to manage your own affairs. Independence should not be merely theoretical. Such conversations became commonplace, revealing Adrian's genuine desire to support her autonomy while offering his expertise and resources. He never presumed to make decisions for her, but he was always available to provide advice or assistance when she requested it. The evenings brought even greater intimacy as they developed the habit of spending time together in the library, reading companionably or engaging in discussions about literature, philosophy, and current events. Evangeline discovered that Adrian was remarkably well-read and possessed strong opinions on a wide range of subjects, from social reform to scientific advancement. I have been reading about the working conditions in the textile mills, Evangeline said one evening as they sat before the library fire. The descriptions are quite disturbing, children working 14-hour days in dangerous conditions. It is one of the great moral challenges of our time, Adrian agreed, setting down his own book to give her his full attention. The pursuit of profit has led to the exploitation of those least able to protect themselves. Is there nothing that can be done? Surely Parliament could pass laws to protect workers. There are those of us who are trying, Adrian said with obvious frustration, but the mill owners have considerable influence, and they argue that regulation would harm England's competitiveness in international markets. And you, what do you argue? That a nation's true strength lies not in its ability to exploit the vulnerable, but in its commitment to justice and human dignity, Adrian said with passionate conviction. Evangeline, what good is economic prosperity if it is built on the suffering of children? Such discussions revealed depths of character that continued to surprise and delight Evangeline. The man she had feared as cold and cruel proved to be deeply concerned with social justice and willing to use his position and influence to advocate for those without power. But it was the small daily kindnesses that truly won her heart. Adrian seemed to notice everything. When she was tired, when she was worried, when she was particularly happy about something. He would adjust their plans to accommodate her moods, surprise her with small gifts that showed his attention to her preferences, and create opportunities for her to pursue interests that brought her joy. "I noticed that you have been spending considerable time in the conservatory," Adrian said one afternoon as they walked through the castle's extensive gardens. "Are you interested in botany?" "I have always loved plants and flowers," Evangeline admitted. "At home, and that is at my father's house, I maintained a small garden. It was one of my greatest pleasures." "Then you must make use of our conservatory as you see fit," Adrian said immediately. "In fact, if you would like to expand it or modify it in any way, you have only to speak with the head gardener. He is quite knowledgeable and would be delighted to assist you. You would not mind if I made changes?" "Evangeline, this is your home now," Adrian said with gentle firmness. "You should feel free to modify it in whatever ways would make you happy. The conservatory, the gardens, even the interior of the castle, all of it is yours to arrange as you see fit." The generosity of the offer and the trust it implied moved Evangeline deeply. Adrian was not just giving her permission to make changes, he was actively encouraging her to make the castle truly her home. As the weeks passed, Evangeline found herself falling in love, not just with Adrian's kindness and intelligence, but with the man himself. She began to notice the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, the way he listened to her with complete attention, as if her thoughts were the most important thing in the world. But with this growing love came an unexpected burden, guilt about the circumstances that had brought them together. The more she learned about Adrian's character, the more she understood that he deserved a wife who had chosen him freely, not one who had been forced into marriage by financial desperation. "Adrian," she said one evening, as they sat together in the library, "may I ask you something that has been troubling me?" "Of course," he replied, immediately setting aside his book and giving her his full attention. "Do you ever regret that our marriage was arranged? Do you ever wish you had been free to choose a wife who wanted to marry you, rather than one who was forced into it?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her face with the intensity she had come to recognize as his way of considering important questions carefully. "Evangeline," he said finally, "I regret that you were forced into a situation where marriage to me seemed like your only option. I regret that your father's debts put you in such a position. But I do not regret that circumstances brought you to me, even though I did not choose you freely. Even though you did not choose me initially," Adrian corrected gently. "Evangeline, every day since our wedding, you have chosen to be here, to share your thoughts with me, to build something meaningful between us. Those choices matter more to me than the circumstances that brought us together. But surely you must sometimes wonder what might have happened if you had been free to court someone who fell in love with you before marriage rather than after." Adrian's expression grew tender at her words. "Are you telling me that you have fallen in love with me, Evangeline?" The direct question caught her off guard, and she felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and hope. That is, Adrian, I have come to care for you very deeply, more deeply than I ever thought possible when we first married. And I have fallen completely in love with you," Adrian said with quiet intensity. "Evangeline, I love your intelligence, your compassion, your strength of character. I love the way you think about complex problems, the way you care about people less fortunate than yourself, the way you have transformed this house from a place of solitude into a true home." "You love me?" Evangeline whispered, her heart racing at his declaration. "I love you," Adrian confirmed, moving closer to take her hands in his. "Evangeline, I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. You have brought light and joy into my life in ways I had given up hoping for. And I love you," Evangeline said, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "Adrian, I love you so much that it frightens me sometimes. I never dreamed that I could feel this way about anyone." When Adrian kissed her, it was with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them over the weeks of their marriage. It was nothing like the cold, formal kiss of their wedding ceremony, but a true expression of love and desire that left them both breathless. "Evangeline," Adrian said against her lips, "you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. You have given me everything I never dared to hope for, and you have shown me what love can be," Evangeline replied, her hands framing his face as she studied the features that had become so dear to her. "Adrian, you have been so patient with me, so kind, so generous. You have given me time to discover my own feelings without pressure or expectation. I wanted you to choose me freely, Adrian said simply. Evangeline, I knew that you had been forced into our marriage, and I hoped that by showing you who I really was, by giving you independence and security, you might decide that staying with me was something you wanted, rather than something you had to do. Is that why you gave me the estates? To ensure that I would have choices? Partly, Adrian admitted, but also because I could not bear the thought of you feeling trapped or dependent. Evangeline, I wanted our marriage to be a partnership between equals, not a relationship where you felt obligated to stay because you had no other options. The thoughtfulness behind his actions, the careful consideration of her feelings and autonomy, moved Evangeline beyond words. Adrian, you have given me so much more than financial independence. You have given me respect, companionship, and love. You have shown me what marriage can be when both people truly care for each other. And you have shown me that it is possible to love again without fear, Adrian replied. Evangeline, after losing Catherine and Margaret, I thought I was done with love, done with the vulnerability that comes with caring deeply for another person. You have taught me that the risk is worth taking when the person is worth loving. As they held each other in the warm glow of the library fire, both understood that they had found something precious and rare, a love that had grown from understanding and respect rather than mere passion, a partnership that promised to deepen and strengthen with time. But even as Evangeline reveled in the joy of their mutual declaration, a part of her mind was already turning to the future and the challenges that lay ahead. Their love was real and deep, but it had been born from an arranged marriage that had shocked society and created expectations that would need to be navigated carefully. The Ton was watching their marriage with fascination and speculation, waiting to see whether the Devil Duke's shocking wedding gift had been a gesture of genuine affection or merely an elaborate display of wealth designed to impress. How they conducted themselves as a couple, how they presented their relationship to society, would determine not just their own happiness, but their effectiveness as leaders in their community. But for now, in the privacy of their library, with the fire crackling softly and the rest of the world shut out, Evangeline was content to simply be held by the man she loved, marveling at the journey that had brought them from fear and suspicion to this moment of perfect understanding and mutual devotion. The wedding gift that had shocked the Ton had indeed changed everything. Not just their circumstances, but their hearts, their hopes, and their understanding of what marriage could be when it was built on love rather than mere convenience. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an unexpected visitor whose arrival would test the strength of the love that Adrian and Evangeline had built together. Lord Pemberton appeared at Ravenshollow Castle on a grey November morning, his presence announced by a flurry of activity among the servants and an air of tension that seemed to permeate the ancient walls. "Your Grace," the butler informed Adrian with obvious unease, "Lord Pemberton has arrived and requests an immediate audience. He says it is a matter of considerable urgency." Adrian's expression darkened at the news. Lord Pemberton was not a friend, but a business associate, whose visits typically involved requests for favours or attempts to manipulate political situations to his advantage. His presence at Ravenshollow, particularly without prior arrangement, suggested trouble of a significant nature. "Show him to my study," Adrian instructed, "and please inform Her Grace that we have a visitor, though she need not feel obligated to receive him if she prefers not to." Evangeline, who had been working in the conservatory when Lord Pemberton arrived, chose to join her husband in receiving their unexpected guest. Something in the butler's manner had suggested that this was not a social call, and she felt a protective instinct toward Adrian that made her want to be present for whatever unpleasantness might be forthcoming. Lord Pemberton was a man in his 50s, whose florid complexion and expanding waistline spoke to a life of considerable indulgence. His small, calculating eyes and thin-lipped smile had always made Evangeline uncomfortable during their previous social encounters, and his presence in their home felt like an intrusion. Your Grace, he said with exaggerated courtesy, as he bowed to both Adrian and Evangeline. "I do apologize for arriving without prior notice, but I felt that the matter I wished to discuss could not wait for the formalities of correspondence." "Lord Pemberton," Adrian replied with cool politeness, "you are welcome at Ravenshollow, though I confess myself curious about what could be so urgent as to require immediate attention." "It concerns your wife's inheritance," Lord Pemberton said, his eyes fixed on Evangeline with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Your Grace, I have recently come into possession of information that I believe will be of considerable interest to both of you." Evangeline felt a chill of apprehension at his words. The estates that Adrian had given her were legally hers, the transfers properly executed and recorded. What could Lord Pemberton possibly know about them that would warrant such a dramatic visit? "What sort of information?" Adrian asked, his voice carrying a warning that suggested he was already prepared for unpleasantness. "Information about the irregularities in the original sale of the Hartwell estates," Lord Pemberton said with obvious satisfaction. "Your Grace, it seems that certain aspects of those transactions were not entirely legal." "Explain yourself," Adrian said sharply, moving closer to Evangeline in a gesture of protection that did not go unnoticed by their visitor. "The debts that forced the sale of the estates were artificially inflated," Lord Pemberton said, with the air of someone delivering devastating news. "It appears that certain gambling debts attributed to Mr. Hartwell were actually forgeries, created to force the sale of properties that certain parties wished to acquire at below-market prices." Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words sank in. "Are you saying that my father's debts were fabricated?" "I am saying that a significant portion of them were fraudulent," Lord Pemberton confirmed with obvious relish. "Your Grace, your father was certainly a gambler, but the debts that forced the sale of your family's estates were largely fictional, created by men who wanted to acquire valuable properties at a fraction of their worth." "Who?" Adrian demanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Who was responsible for this fraud?" "That, Your Grace, is where the matter becomes delicate," Lord Pemberton said with a smile that made Evangeline's stomach turn. "The men responsible are well-connected, influential members of society whose exposure would create considerable scandal." "I care nothing for scandal when it comes to justice," Adrian said firmly. "Lord Pemberton, if you have evidence of fraud, it must be presented to the proper authorities." "Ah, but that is precisely the problem," Lord Pemberton said with obvious satisfaction. "Your Grace, the evidence I possess implicates men who could make life very difficult for anyone who chose to pursue legal action against them." "What are you suggesting?" Evangeline asked, though she was beginning to suspect that this visit was not about justice, but about something far more sinister. "I am suggesting that this information could be problematic for certain people if it were to become public," Lord Pemberton said with false sympathy. "Your Grace, the revelation that your marriage was based on fraudulent circumstances could create considerable embarrassment for your family." "Our marriage was not based on fraudulent circumstances," Adrian said with dangerous calm. "It was based on the situation as we understood it at the time. But society might not see it that way," Lord Pemberton said with obvious pleasure. "Your Grace, if it became known that the debts that necessitated your marriage were largely fabricated, people might wonder whether you were complicit in the fraud. They might question whether your dramatic wedding gift was actually an attempt to cover up your involvement in the scheme." Evangeline felt sick as she realized the trap that was being laid for them. Lord Pemberton was not bringing them information out of concern for justice. He was threatening them with scandal and suspicion that could destroy Adrian's reputation and their happiness together. "What do you want?" Adrian asked bluntly, clearly recognizing the threat for what it was. "I want nothing more than to protect my friends from unnecessary embarrassment," Lord Pemberton said with mock innocence. "Your Grace, I am prepared to ensure that this information remains private, that no questions are raised about the circumstances of your marriage or your subsequent generosity to your wife." "In exchange for what?" Evangeline asked, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "In exchange for your support in certain business ventures that require the backing of influential families," Lord Pemberton said smoothly. "Your Grace, there are opportunities in the textile industry that would benefit greatly from the Duke of Ravenshollow's endorsement." "You want me to use my influence to support business ventures that I know nothing about," Adrian said with obvious disgust. "Lord Pemberton, you are asking me to compromise my integrity for the sake of protecting my reputation." "I am asking you to be practical," Lord Pemberton replied with a shrug. "Your Grace, the textile mills I represent could provide employment for thousands of workers. Surely that is worth some flexibility in your usual standards." "What sort of textile mills?" Evangeline asked, remembering their conversations about working conditions and child labor. "Efficient operations that maximize productivity and profit," Lord Pemberton said with obvious evasion. "Your Grace, these mills represent the future of English manufacturing. Mills that employ children in dangerous conditions," Adrian said with growing anger. "Mills that prioritize profit over human welfare. Lord Pemberton, you are asking me to endorse the very practices I have spent years trying to reform." I am asking you to be realistic about the price of maintaining your current, comfortable situation, Lord Pemberton said with a coldness that made his true nature clear. Your Grace, scandal has a way of destroying even the most carefully constructed reputations. And blackmail has a way of destroying the blackmailer, Adrian replied with quiet menace. Lord Pemberton, you have made a serious error in judgment if you believe that I will compromise my principles to protect myself from gossip. It is not just gossip that concerns me, Lord Pemberton said with obvious satisfaction. Your Grace, there are those who would be very interested to learn that your wife's inheritance might not be as legitimate as it appears. Questions might be raised about whether the properties were obtained through fraudulent means. The properties were purchased legally and transferred properly, Evangeline said with as much dignity as she could muster. Whatever fraud may have occurred in their original sale has nothing to do with their current ownership. But the court of public opinion is not always concerned with legal technicalities, Lord Pemberton said with false sympathy. Your Grace, society loves nothing more than a scandal involving the mighty brought low. The story of a duke who unknowingly married a woman whose inheritance was tainted by fraud. It would be the talk of London for months. Let them talk, Adrian said firmly. Lord Pemberton, I will not be blackmailed into supporting ventures that exploit workers and endanger children. If you choose to spread your poison, we will face the consequences with clear consciences. How noble, Lord Pemberton said with obvious mockery. Your Grace, I hope your principles will provide comfort when your political allies distance themselves from the scandal, when invitations cease to arrive, when your wife finds herself ostracized from polite society. My wife will find herself supported by those who matter, people of genuine character, who judge others by their actions rather than by malicious gossip, Adrian replied with passionate conviction. We shall see, Lord Pemberton said, rising from his chair with obvious satisfaction. Your Grace, I will give you 1 week to reconsider your position. After that, I fear I will have no choice but to share my information with those who might find it illuminating. After Lord Pemberton's departure, Adrian and Evangeline sat in stunned silence, grappling with the implications of what they had just learned. The revelation that the debts forcing their marriage had been largely fraudulent was shocking enough, but the threat of scandal and social ostracism was even more troubling. Adrian, Evangeline said finally, her voice trembling with emotion, I am so sorry. This is all my fault. If my father had not been in debt, if I had not needed to marry for security, you would never have been put in this position. Evangeline, none of this is your fault, Adrian said firmly, moving to take her in his arms. You were as much a victim of this fraud as anyone. The men who created those false debts are responsible for the consequences, not you. But the scandal, if Lord Pemberton carries out his threat, it could destroy your reputation, your political career, everything you have worked to build. My reputation will survive because it is based on truth rather than lies, Adrian said with quiet confidence. Evangeline, I will not compromise my principles to appease a blackmailer, regardless of the consequences. But what if he is right? What if society chooses to believe the worst about us? Then we will face that challenge together, Adrian said with absolute certainty. Evangeline, I love you, and I am proud to be your husband. No amount of gossip or scandal can change those fundamental truths. Adrian, perhaps I should return the estates. If I no longer owned them, if there were no question about my inheritance, it might reduce the potential for scandal. Absolutely not, Adrian said with passionate intensity. Evangeline, those properties are yours by right, regardless of the fraud that forced their original sale. I will not allow you to be victimized twice by the same criminals. But if keeping them puts you at risk, then we will face that risk together, Adrian interrupted. Evangeline, I did not give you those estates so that you could return them at the first sign of trouble. I gave them to you because they belong to your family, and because I wanted you to have security and independence. And I love you for that generosity, Evangeline said with tears in her eyes. But Adrian, I cannot bear the thought that my presence in your life might damage everything you have worked to achieve. Your presence in my life has enhanced everything I have worked to achieve, Adrian said firmly. Evangeline, you have made me a better man, a more effective leader, a happier person. I will not allow Lord Pemberton's threats to make me question the greatest blessing of my life. Over the following days, as they waited to see whether Lord Pemberton would carry out his threat, Adrian and Evangeline found their love tested in ways they had never anticipated. The knowledge that their happiness might be destroyed by forces beyond their control created a tension that affected every aspect of their daily lives. "I have been thinking about what Lord Pemberton said," Evangeline said one evening as they sat in the library, the familiar comfort of their routine overshadowed by the uncertainty that hung over their future. "About the men who were responsible for the fraud. If they are as powerful as he suggests, what hope do we have of exposing them?" "We have the hope that comes from being on the side of truth and justice," Adrian replied, though his expression showed the strain of the past week. "Evangeline, powerful men are not immune to the consequences of their actions, especially when those actions involve fraud and theft. But if Lord Pemberton is right about the scandal it would create, then we will weather that scandal with our heads held high," Adrian said with determination. "Evangeline, I have been thinking about this situation, and I believe there may be a way to turn Lord Pemberton's threats against him." "What do you mean?" "I mean that blackmail is a crime, and Lord Pemberton has made his intentions quite clear," Adrian said with growing excitement. "If we can document his threats, if we can prove his attempts to extort compliance through intimidation, we may be able to expose not just his crimes, but those of his associates. You want to set a trap for him." "I want to give him enough rope to hang himself," Adrian said grimly. "Evangeline, men like Lord Pemberton rely on their victims' fear to maintain their power. If we can demonstrate that we are not afraid, that we are willing to fight back, we may find that his threats are less dangerous than they appear." The plan that Adrian devised was both simple and audacious. When Lord Pemberton returned for their answer, they would appear to capitulate to his demands while secretly documenting his threats and demands. The evidence they gathered would then be presented to the authorities, along with any information they could uncover about the original fraud. "It is risky," Adrian admitted, as they prepared for Lord Pemberton's return. "If we are discovered, if he realizes what we are doing, the consequences could be severe. And if we do nothing, the consequences will be certain," Evangeline replied with quiet courage. "Adrian, I would rather fight for our happiness than surrender it to a blackmailer." "Are you certain?" "Evangeline, once we begin this course of action, there will be no turning back. We will be committed to seeing it through regardless of the personal cost." "I am certain," Evangeline said without hesitation. "Adrian, you have shown me what it means to live with integrity and courage. I will not ask you to compromise those qualities to protect me from scandal." When Lord Pemberton arrived for their answer, he found a couple who appeared to have been broken by the weight of his threats. Adrian's manner was subdued, his usual confidence replaced by what seemed like resignation, while Evangeline appeared pale and distressed. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said with obvious satisfaction, "I trust you have given careful consideration to our previous conversation?" "We have," Adrian replied with apparent reluctance. "Lord Pemberton, while I find your methods distasteful, I cannot ignore the potential consequences for my wife if this information becomes public." "A wise decision," Lord Pemberton said with obvious pleasure. "Your Grace, I knew that a man of your intelligence would recognize the practical realities of the situation." "What exactly do you require from me?" Adrian asked, his voice carefully controlled to suggest reluctant compliance. "Your public endorsement of the Pemberton Mill Company, your investment in our expansion plans, and your influence to prevent any government interference in our operations," Lord Pemberton said with obvious relish. "Your Grace, these are reasonable requests that will benefit many people. And if I refuse to provide such support, then I fear the information about your wife's complicated inheritance will become public knowledge," Lord Pemberton said with false regret. "Your Grace, I would hate to see such a lovely couple destroyed by scandal, but I have my own interests to protect." "I see," Adrian said quietly, "and this arrangement would continue indefinitely? As long as our business interests align, I see no reason why our understanding cannot continue," Lord Pemberton said with a smile that made Evangeline's skin crawl. "Your Grace, I am a reasonable man who asks only for reasonable cooperation." "Very well," Adrian said with apparent resignation. "Lord Pemberton, you have made your position clear, and I accept the necessity of complying with your requests." "Excellent," Lord Pemberton said, rising from his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Your Grace, I knew you would see reason. I will have the necessary documents prepared for your signature within the week." After Lord Pemberton's departure, Adrian and Evangeline sat in silence for several minutes, both shaken by the explicit nature of his threats and demands. But they had accomplished their goal. They now had clear evidence of blackmail and extortion that could be presented to the authorities. "He actually believes we will comply," Evangeline said with amazement. "Adrian, his arrogance is extraordinary. His arrogance will be his downfall, Adrian replied with grim satisfaction. Evangeline, we now have everything we need to expose, not just his blackmail, but the entire network of fraud that made it possible. What happens next? Next, we take our evidence to the authorities and let justice take its course, Adrian said with quiet determination. And then, my dear wife, we prepare to face whatever consequences may come from our decision to fight rather than surrender. As they prepared for the battle that lay ahead, both Adrian and Evangeline understood that they had reached a turning point in their marriage and their lives. The love that had grown between them would now be tested by forces beyond their control, but they would face those challenges together, united by their commitment to each other and to the principles that defined their character. The wedding gift that had shocked the ton was about to be overshadowed by an even greater shock, the exposure of a network of fraud and corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. And at the center of it all would be a duke and duchess whose love had given them the courage to fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. The confrontation with the authorities began 3 days later, when Adrian presented their evidence to Sir William Hartley, the Chief Magistrate of Yorkshire, and one of the few men in the region whose integrity was beyond question. The meeting took place in Sir William's private chambers, away from the prying eyes and ears that might carry word back to Lord Pemberton and his associates. Your Grace, Sir William said after reviewing the documents and witness statements that Adrian had prepared, this is a most serious matter. If your allegations are correct, we are dealing with a conspiracy that involves fraud, forgery, and extortion on a considerable scale. I am confident that investigation will prove the accuracy of our claims, Adrian replied firmly. Sir William, Lord Pemberton was quite explicit in his threats and demands. He made no attempt to disguise his intentions. The difficulty, Your Grace, is that the men he claims to represent are powerful and well-connected. Accusations against them will not be taken lightly, and they will have resources to defend themselves that most criminals lack. Are you suggesting that justice is not available to those who lack sufficient influence? Evangeline asked with quiet intensity. I am suggesting that justice for the powerful requires evidence that is absolutely unassailable, Sir William replied with obvious regret. Your Grace, these men will hire the finest lawyers, will use every connection and favor owed to them to escape consequences. We must be prepared for a battle that will test our resolve and our resources. Then we must ensure that our evidence is indeed unassailable, Adrian said with determination. Sir William, what additional proof would be required to guarantee successful prosecution? Ideally, we would need documentation of the original fraud, the forged gambling debts, evidence of the conspiracy to depress property values, testimony from those who participated in the scheme, Sir William explained. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton's blackmail attempt, while serious, is only the tip of the iceberg. To truly expose this network, we need to uncover the full scope of their operations. The investigation that followed was both exhausting and dangerous. Adrian used his connections throughout Yorkshire and beyond to trace the origins of the fraudulent debts, while Evangeline worked with their solicitors to examine the legal documents surrounding the sale of her family's estates. What they discovered was a pattern of fraud that extended far beyond her father's case. Adrian, Evangeline said one evening as they reviewed their findings in the library, look at these property transfers. The same pattern appears in at least a dozen cases, gambling debts that appear suddenly, forcing quick sales to the same group of buyers. All properties that were subsequently sold at significant profits, Adrian noted with growing anger. Evangeline, this was not opportunistic fraud, but a systematic scheme to steal valuable properties from families in financial distress. How many families were affected? How many people lost their homes and their heritage to these criminals? Too many, Adrian said grimly. But Evangeline, each case we document strengthens our position and increases the likelihood that justice will be served. Their investigation was not conducted in secret, and it soon became apparent that Lord Pemberton and his associates were aware of their activities. The threats that followed were both subtle and explicit, designed to intimidate them into abandoning their pursuit of justice. Your Grace, said their head groom one morning, his face pale with concern, there were men asking questions in the village last night. Questions about your activities, your visitors, your loyalty to your friends. What sort of questions? Adrian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Questions about whether you might be the sort of man who would betray old friendships for the sake of newer alliances, the groom said carefully. Your Grace, they were not subtle in their implications. And how did the villagers respond to such questions? With the contempt they deserved, the groom said with obvious pride. Your Grace, you have the loyalty of everyone on this estate. No amount of money or threats will change that. But the pressure was not limited to intimidation. Within days of their investigation becoming known, Adrian began receiving visits from political allies who urged him to reconsider his course of action. Adrian, said Lord Ashford during one such visit, I understand your desire for justice, but you must consider the broader implications of your actions. The men you are accusing have considerable influence in Parliament. Are you suggesting that their political influence should protect them from prosecution for fraud? Adrian asked with obvious disgust. I am suggesting that the scandal you are creating could damage the Conservative Party's ability to govern effectively, Lord Ashford replied with obvious frustration. Adrian, your reform legislation depends on the support of men who will not appreciate being associated with this controversy. My reform legislation depends on the support of men who believe in justice and the rule of law, Adrian corrected firmly. Lord Ashford, if our party cannot survive the exposure of criminals within its ranks, then perhaps it does not deserve to govern. That is a very idealistic position, Lord Ashford said with obvious disapproval. Adrian, politics requires compromise, accommodation, the ability to work with imperfect people for the greater good. Politics requires integrity, Adrian replied without hesitation. Lord Ashford, I will not compromise my principles to protect criminals, regardless of their political affiliations. The pressure intensified when the scandal began to affect Evangeline directly. Invitations that had once arrived regularly ceased to come, and when they did attend social functions, they found themselves increasingly isolated from their former associates. Lady Pemberton cut me directly at Lady Ashford's tea yesterday, Evangeline reported one afternoon, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious hurt. She actually turned her back when I approached to greet her. I am sorry, my dear, Adrian said with genuine regret. Evangeline, I know this ostracism is difficult to bear, but we cannot allow social pressure to deter us from seeking justice. I understand that, and I support our course of action completely, Evangeline said firmly. But Adrian, I worry about the cost to your political career. If we are isolated from society, how can you continue to advocate for the reforms that matter so much to you? Perhaps I will find new allies among those who value justice over convenience, Adrian said, with growing conviction. Evangeline, if the price of maintaining my current political position is silence about fraud and corruption, then perhaps it is time to seek a different kind of influence. The breakthrough in their case came from an unexpected source, one of Lord Pemberton's own associates, who approached them through intermediaries with an offer to provide evidence in exchange for protection from prosecution. Mr. Whitmore was involved in the forgery of documents, but claims he was coerced into participation, Sir William explained during a secret meeting at Ravenshollow Castle. Your Grace, he is prepared to provide detailed testimony about the entire operation, including the names of all participants and the methods they used. What does he want in return? Adrian asked suspiciously. Immunity from prosecution and protection from retaliation, Sir William replied. Your Grace, Mr. Whitmore is genuinely frightened of what Lord Pemberton and his associates might do if they discover his cooperation. And his testimony would be sufficient to secure convictions? Combined with the evidence you have already gathered, it would be more than sufficient, Sir William confirmed. Your Grace, Mr. Whitmore can provide the documentation and insider knowledge that we need to prove the full scope of the conspiracy. The decision to accept Mr. Whitmore's cooperation was not made lightly. Both Adrian and Evangeline understood that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return, committing themselves irrevocably to a course of action that would make them permanent enemies of powerful men. Are you certain about this? Adrian asked Evangeline as they prepared to give Sir William their answer. Once we accept his testimony, once we move forward with prosecution, there will be no possibility of reconciliation with Lord Pemberton and his associates. I am certain, Evangeline replied without hesitation. Adrian, these men destroyed my family's legacy and attempted to blackmail us into supporting their exploitation of workers. They deserve to face the consequences of their actions, even if those consequences include our continued ostracism from society. Even then, Evangeline said firmly, Adrian, I would rather be ostracized for doing what is right than accepted for doing what is wrong. The arrests began at dawn on a cold December morning, exactly 1 year after their wedding. Lord Pemberton was taken into custody at his London residence, while his associates were arrested simultaneously across England. The coordination required to prevent any of them from fleeing or destroying evidence was extraordinary, involving magistrates, constables, and government officials throughout the country. "It is done," Sir William reported to Adrian and Evangeline later that day. "Your Grace, all of the principal conspirators are in custody, and we have seized their records and correspondence. The evidence of their crimes is overwhelming." "And Mr. Whitmore," Evangeline asked, "is safe and prepared to testify," Sir William confirmed. "Your Grace, his cooperation has been invaluable. Without his insider knowledge, we might never have uncovered the full scope of their operations." The trials that followed were a sensation throughout England, with newspapers providing daily coverage of the proceedings and society following every development with fascination. The revelation that respected members of the aristocracy had been involved in systematic fraud shocked even those who thought themselves cynical about the corruption of the powerful. "The testimony today was devastating," Adrian reported to Evangeline after attending the proceedings. "Mr. Whitmore provided detailed accounts of how they forged documents, bribed officials, and intimidated victims. The jury was visibly shocked by the scope of their crimes. And Lord Pemberton's response? Denial, bluster, and attempts to shift blame to his subordinates," Adrian said with obvious disgust. "But the evidence against him is too strong for such tactics to succeed." The verdicts, when they came, were unanimous and severe. Lord Pemberton and his principal associates were convicted of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, receiving sentences that would effectively end their careers and their influence in society. The financial penalties imposed would force them to make restitution to their victims, while their imprisonment would serve as a warning to others who might be tempted by similar schemes. "Justice has been served," Sir William announced as the final verdicts were read. "Your Grace, your courage in pursuing this case has resulted in the exposure and punishment of criminals who thought themselves above the law." But even as they celebrated the success of their fight for justice, Adrian and Evangeline understood that their victory had come at a considerable personal cost. Their former social circle remained largely closed to them, and their political allies had distanced themselves from the controversy surrounding the trials. "Do you regret it?" Evangeline asked one evening as they sat together in their library, reading letters of congratulation from those who supported their actions. "Adrian, do you regret the price we have paid for justice?" "I regret that justice required such a price," Adrian replied thoughtfully. "But Evangeline, I do not regret our choice to fight for what was right. We have proven that the powerful are not immune from consequences, and that has value beyond any social or political cost. And our future? What happens now that we have made ourselves enemies of so many influential people? Now we build new alliances with people who share our values," Adrian said with growing excitement. "Evangeline, there are many in Parliament and society who have been waiting for someone to take a stand against corruption. Our actions have given them courage to speak out as well." Indeed, the weeks following the trials brought a stream of visitors to Ravenshollow Castle, reformers, activists, and politicians who had been inspired by Adrian and Evangeline's courage to challenge the established order. Their drawing room became a gathering place for those committed to social justice and political reform. "Your Grace," said Mr. Wilberforce during one such gathering, "your example has shown us that it is possible to fight corruption and win. You have given hope to all of us who believe that government should serve justice rather than privilege." "We simply did what conscience demanded," Evangeline replied with characteristic modesty. "Mr. Wilberforce, the real work lies ahead, ensuring that such corruption cannot take root again." "Indeed," Adrian agreed. "We must use this moment to strengthen the laws that protect the vulnerable, and to create institutions that can resist the influence of those who would exploit their power for personal gain." As their first year of marriage drew to a close, Adrian and Evangeline found themselves in a position they could never have anticipated. They had lost some friends, but gained others whose friendship was based on shared principles rather than social convenience. They had sacrificed some political influence but had gained moral authority that made their voices more powerful than ever. "Do you remember our wedding day?" Adrian asked as they prepared to celebrate their first anniversary. "Do you remember how terrified you were of the man you were marrying?" "I remember being certain that I was marrying a monster," Evangeline said with a laugh. "Adrian, I could never have imagined that the man I feared would become the love of my life and my partner in fighting for justice. And I could never have imagined that an arranged marriage would bring me not just love but purpose," Adrian replied, taking her in his arms. "Evangeline, you have made me a better man and a more effective advocate for those who need our help. We have made each other better, Evangeline corrected. Adrian, together we have proven that love and justice can triumph over fear and corruption. As they held each other in the library where they had first declared their love, both understood that their marriage had become something far greater than either had dared to hope. They had found not just personal happiness, but a shared mission that gave meaning to their lives and their love. The wedding gift that had shocked the ton had indeed changed everything, not just their circumstances, but their understanding of what marriage could be when it was built on love, respect, and shared commitment to justice. They had faced the threat of scandal and social ostracism, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever to use their position and influence for the good of others. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow had become more than husband and wife. They had become partners in the fight for a more just and equitable society, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories are those that extend beyond personal happiness to embrace the welfare of all. If this tale of unexpected love born from arranged marriage, of courage in the face of corruption, and of a wedding gift that revealed the true heart of a feared duke touched your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have had the courage to fight powerful enemies for justice? Could you have seen past reputation to discover the true character beneath? Your engagement helps us bring you more stories where love conquers fear and proves that the greatest gifts are those that transform not just circumstances, but hearts and souls. Thank you for joining us in the halls of Ravenshollow Castle, and until our next romantic tale unfolds, remember that sometimes the most feared hearts hide the greatest capacity for love and justice.